Chapter 3. Arriving at the Body by Alessandra Lemma, 2002. Body Schema, Image, and Imagining. Part 2. The Case of Ms. A. Ms. A was an MTF transgender in her late 20s who was referred for help as part of her decision to seek SRS. At the time, she was feeling depressed and suffered with panic attacks associated with being in outside spaces. By the time I met her, she had been living as a woman for over 2 years. Her physical presentation was the first thing that hit me. I use the word hit advisedly to denote a powerful visual dynamic that is present in this work, in the service of passing, and hence accompanied by the need to edit the given body. Transgender individuals who subscribe to the gender binary often adopt a caricatured/stereotyped feminine or masculine look that tends to result in an outward appearance that does the opposite of what it is consciously intended to do. It actively draws attention to an incongruity between the biologically assigned gender and the gender of identification. I am referring here specifically to the choice of clothes and the way makeup is used. The excess it betrays struck me forcefully with Ms. A, as it has done in other cases, as if a possible, unconscious, function of this incongruous visual presentation was precisely to draw my gaze towards the self's condition of incongruity, to take it in and digest it for her. I say this because not all transgender individuals present in this more exaggerated manner. An only child, Ms. A's early life was a miserable experience punctuated by frequent and at times violent rows between her parents, both of whom appeared to have been emotionally unavailable. Her mother had severe problems with alcohol. Her father was described as a distant, irascible man who died in her late adolescence. Neither parent was felt to have been physically affectionate. She recalled dressing up in her mother's clothes from about the age of 4. She said she could identify the moment when it became clear to her that she was a girl around the age of 5. Her cross-dressing remained a largely secret activity in which she often indulged when her mother was asleep after her frequent alcoholic binges. This activity was comforting, but she denied any sexual arousal associated with it. I gained the impression that at times the cross-dressing had functioned as an attempt to create on her skin the loving touch of a fantasized loving mother, which replaced the actual mother who would not touch her. Ferenczi indeed noted how bodily self-stimulation could be understood as a substitute on one's own body for the lost object, 1938, 23-24. Ms. A told me that her mother did see her cross-dressing a few times and recalled that the mother seemingly ignored this. However, she also related one instance when, aged 6, her mother saw her wearing her clothes, told her she looked ridiculous, and laughed. Ms. A recalled feeling very ashamed of her body, whatever her actual mother may have done or not. The mother was felt internally by Ms. A to have either not responded at all to her perception of an incongruence between her expectation of what Ms. A should look like and Ms. A's experience of her own body, or to have actively ridiculed her when faced with this incongruence. This left Ms. A not only filled with shame, but also with an unmetabolized experience of a profound incongruity at the level of her bodily self. As I listened to these accounts, I obviously had no access to external information that would allow me to corroborate them, so my focus here is on what I understood them to convey about Ms. A's internal world. I was struck by the painful misattunement reported by Ms. A in her exchanges with her mother, which resonated countertransferentially with the way in which I felt unusually conscious of how I looked at her and of the words I used as if not understanding her would be catastrophic. Ms. A recalled always feeling at odds in her given body. She had felt estranged from it, as if it belonged to someone else. She did not hate her male body, but neither did she feel at home in it. At school, she had been drawn to friendships with girls and disliked playing with boys. As she grew older, she felt that she was going to explode. Under the pressure of the reality she had to conceal from all, she felt she was a woman in a man's body. At 18, shortly after the father's death, she left home. She remained thereafter in sporadic contact with her mother. Ms. A was ill at ease in her body, which looked as if it belonged to someone else. I say this because her visual presentation jarred. She wore very short skirts that exposed her very athletic and unmistakable masculine physique. Her breasts, enhanced by hormone treatment and other aids, were very much on display, but looked incongruous with the rest of her body. There was nothing sexual in her presentation. Rather, her body felt shut down, turned away from anything alive, like a ghost dressed up with nowhere to go. I understood this to be, at least in part, a consequence of a lack of early bodily cathexis by either parent. This had left Ms. A without recourse to an experience of a desiring gaze or touch directed towards her that could provide a bridge for the organization of her own pleasure in her body and the elaboration of her sexual desire. As these sessions were face-to-face, I sensed that a great deal was communicated and enacted between us through our respective gazes. For my part, one had to take note of how I would look at her. I struggled to take her in visually, and not infrequently I found myself wishing she were lying on the couch and not sitting opposite me. It was important to recognize this powerful countertransference reaction because it helped me to gain some understanding of that which could not yet be put into words between us. Very quickly, Ms. A developed an intense transference towards me. She became preoccupied with the sessions and what was in my mind about her. She found the gaps between sessions very difficult. In the early years, I sensed her hunger, quite literally, for space in my mind. I took this up in the transference on many occasions. Her response to transference interpretations during this stage was interesting and was itself a manifestation of this hunger. I felt that she settled into the intimacy and immediacy of a transference interpretation instead of being able to make use of it, the so-called here and now become a comfortable, gratifying home that seemingly reassured her that we were very close only to then feel brutally ejected when the session ended. Ms. A often prefaced what she said with, "I guess I'm not explaining this clearly," or, "You won't understand this because I'm putting it so badly." Either way, it seemed as though she felt she was communicating the incommunicable and I, in turn, would not understand her. Not infrequently, I had the strong impression that we both talked, but never actually met. There was something rather sterile in our exchanges. It was only when I took her in visually or when I became aware of her looking at me that something more immediate, if disturbing, transpired. But it took time before we could look together at the experience of looking and being looked at. In the first year, the transference was a rather idealized one during which time I often experienced her as wanting to fuse with me and effectively become me. This fantasy of becoming me was concretely actualized when she arrived for one of her sessions dressed in a manner that was evidently trying to copy one of my outfits. Even her long hair had been styled like mine. The psychological mechanism deployed here is what Resnick, 2001, refers to as psychical transvestism. Through projective identification, the self acquires another person's bodily shape and character, dresses in someone else's clothing, and imitates their gestures and looks. It is a form of imitation that precedes identification and takes place primarily through vision. Gadini, 1969. Such imitations are fantasies of being or becoming the object through modification of one's own body. Over time, we explored her imitation and appropriation of me in this very concrete manner. This led her to recount the long stretches of time when she was left alone in the house as a child with her inebriated mother, dressing up in her clothes, wearing her high heels, as if trying to conjure up an experience of closeness with her mother through imitating her and quite literally stepping into her shoes. However, there was another dimension to my experience of Ms. A's imitation of me that took us in a fruitful direction. The sight of Ms. A wearing a copy of my outfit had a curiously disturbing impact on me. I found myself looking at her, recognizing the vestiges of my outfit, but it now looked ill-fitting. I anxiously thought, I don't look like that. As if I needed to distance myself from what she was exposing. I also felt ridiculed through her impersonation of me, an experience perhaps not dissimilar to how she had felt when her mother laughed at the sight of her cross-dressing. In other words, I reacted as if I was being misrepresented in some way and shown a distorted and denigrated image of myself that I was struggling to take in because it felt alien. That was not how I saw myself or wanted to be seen. As I reflected on this exchange, I thought that Ms. A had somehow turned the tables around and exposed me to an experience of not being accurately mirrored by her in my bodily state. This perspective was eventually helpful in also shedding light on her panic attacks and agoraphobia. Ms. A subjectively experienced public spaces as a hall of mirrors, as she put it. When outside her home, she described feeling haunted by the prospect of catching sight of her reflection in shop windows or being looked at by other people. In those mirrors, she explained, I look all wrong. At such times, she described feeling dizzy, desperate to flee back to the safety of her dark flat. It was as if when in the grip of her panic attacks, she entered a nightmarish experience of being forced to look at a body that did not hang together. 3. I considered whether Ms. A might be suffering from body dysmorphic disorder, BDD, but the overall presentation was not consistent with this. But there are some individuals who present as transgender but are in fact better understood as suffering from BDD. Outside spaces were seemingly equated with distorting reflective surfaces, perhaps not dissimilar to the inebriated eyes of her mother or the absent eyes of her father, in which she could not find herself. It became very important in our work to focus on her deep-seated expectation that her objects could not bear to look at her as she was and take in her experience of a bad fit at the core of who she was, one that was visibly apparent in her bodily presentation. In the work leading up to surgery, during which time she was under the care of a specialist unit, we spent a long time thinking together about the fantasies connected to the surgery. Ms. A related to SRS as the solution with a conviction that reinvigorated itself every time she experienced me as unavailable to her. In these moments we came to understand how the fantasy of the female body she would one day accede to became her way of reconciling herself to her separation from me, perhaps just as she had done as a young child when she lost her mother repeatedly to alcohol. At such times, in her mind, she comforted herself with the fantasy of giving birth to herself and inhabiting a body that was whole, self-sufficient, and a direct replica of an idealized maternal body and mind she felt deprived of, except in this fantasy the body became a copy without originals, Baudrillard, 1988, as the mother was effectively obliterated. In this state of mind, the given body became a ghost of a body that ceased to have any reality or origins. Her penis was experienced then as an alien thing that had nothing to do with her and needed to be cut off. By contrast, her new breasts became the reassurance that she needed no one. The anticipated surgery ceased to function as potentially opening up the possibility of a better life more congruent with her subjective experience of herself, but became instead the means through which she enacted a profound grievance towards her mother. Over time, Ms. A became more receptive to our explorations of her wish to effectively become me/mother so that she could avoid the painful experience of separation, which felt to her like a traumatic expulsion from the mind of the other. However, I want to stress that this did not impact on her strong feeling that she was more at home in a woman's body, and, I should add, it was never the therapeutic aim to change this. I considered my role to be that of helping her understand her experiences so that she could make informed decisions about surgery based on the understandings that emerged. After just over 2 years of therapy, Ms. A underwent SRS. As the date approached, she fluctuated between anxiety and mania. She anticipated how the surgery would finally lay to rest her experience of feeling at odds within herself and in her body. She imagined she could finally allow herself to have a sexual relationship because the body she would reveal to a partner would be the body she really was. Post-surgery, she experienced several physical complications, which led her to feel depressed and desperate that her body would never feel right. Once again, I became very aware of the visual relationship between us. I felt she needed me to take in with my eyes and mind this reconstructed body that she felt was still in pieces. It was as though she needed a witness to this process, one that was willing to look and not shame her. Ms. A was angry with the surgeon for doing a bad job. "I still look and feel wrong," she would say with some reproach. She was painfully aware that even though she no longer had a penis and now had a reconstructed vagina, she still looked more masculine than she wished. This proved to be a very painful time, but it was essential for Ms. A to face the decimation of the fantasy that SRS would take away all the pain that was so concretely located in her body. A dream she reported around this time involved buying a large antique mirror, which she carefully hung above her mantelpiece. During the night, it fell and shattered into pieces. We came to understand this dream as a communication to me about how she looked into my eyes for a mirror that would reassure her that surgery had done the trick, but each time she looked at me/the mirror, she felt she could only see herself still in pieces. I was intrigued by the antique nature of the mirror. I took up with her how this might express a wish for me to reflect back her old body to keep it in mind, that is, when she struggled to do so, because her body and its history were still a part of her despite the surgery. Ms. A became tearful and said that she could not bear to look at any old photos of herself pre-surgery or as a boy. She then composed herself and in a very detached manner said that she was toying with the idea of shredding them. I said that she was letting me know how hard it was to remain connected with her old body and that she now wanted to literally tear to shreds my interpretation, which had perhaps felt like me forcefully exposing her to the reality of her old body and the pain that she carried inside her and which she had hoped the surgery would shred. In the wake of the disappointment about the surgery, it was important to think together about her experience of me as possessing what she wanted and keeping it all for myself. At first, I took this up in terms of me being the woman she wished to be, but I realized eventually that this was not right. My sex and my gender were red herrings. What Ms. A envied most was her perception that I inhabited a desired body and one that could desire. Indeed, she spoke about her perception of me as alive and at ease in myself. These sessions heralded a slow and painful shift in her state of mind towards what we might regard as more depressive functioning. This development was apparent some months later when in an important and spontaneous gesture, she brought photos of herself as a boy to show me how uncomfortable she had looked in this old body. I thought that as well as trying to reassure herself that she had done the right thing by pursuing surgery, she was also beginning to look at a ghostly part of herself as captured in these images of her body from childhood, which was still within her despite the SRS. This helped us understand that part of her adaptation to her post-surgery body could only succeed if she was able to look and take in the male body she once inhabited and what this body was consciously and unconsciously associated with in her mind. A year post-SRS, Ms. A began a sexual relationship, the first in over 10 years, with a man who appeared troubled but who was loving towards her. She shared her story with him and felt accepted. She slowly started to come to life and relate to her body as a potential source of pleasure. Inevitably, perhaps, given her early history, she remained sensitive to slights from others and could easily feel shamed, but she could also understand this better in herself. Her panic attacks subsided significantly, and she obtained work. It seemed as if her body, not only in the context of her new relationship, but also more generally in her experience of herself in the open spaces of life that she had once so feared, was one of greater potentiality. Significantly, she started to wear clothes that were better fitting to her actual physique, thereby diminishing the earlier visual incongruity I remarked upon. When we ended our work, Ms. A remained clear that SRS had been the right thing for her and that therapy had helped her to come to terms with who she was. In Ms. A's case, her parents failed not only to mirror back her experience of incongruity at the core of her subjective bodily experience and gender identity, but in a more general sense, they also failed to mirror her emotional life. In proposing a failure of mirroring as central to understanding Ms. A's transgender identification, I have in mind the impact of repeated experiences of feeling not right in my body, which remained mentally unprocessed and hence became concretized in the body. It is impossible to know with any certainty whether Ms. A's early feeling that she was a girl in a boy's body is best explained with reference to biological and/or psychological factors. In her particular case, a psychogenic account of her transgender identification is compelling given the early history of emotional deprivation, and especially the way the absence of her mother and the hatred for her father who had abandoned her to this fate appeared to have been managed through a feminine identification that supported a fantasy of symbiotic fusion with the mother, Ovsy and Person, 1973, and obliterated the father. I chose to include the case of Ms. A because it illustrates dynamics that I have observed in other individuals. It is also a good example of how, despite the fact that Ms. A's transgender identification was most likely overdetermined and her experience of medical transitioning was far from straightforward, it was clear that she felt this was the right path for her. I observed how the overall quality of life improved for her subsequent to this transition. The given body and the temporal link. The starting point in my work with transgender individuals is the value of recognizing that the given body is important psychically. This does not mean that I privilege the protection of the given body over its modification as the sign, par excellence, of mental health, or that I consider continuity in the representation of the body over time as somehow intrinsically superior to an experience of fluidity and even discontinuity. Rather, I suggest that the developmental history of the given body and the history of what we choose to do to it are significant pieces of the psychic jigsaw that requires integration into the personal narrative we have of our life and of our identity. This history will inevitably reflect both real experiences with other people colored by their projections and desires, and the internal word of object relationships that always mediates our subjective experience. I am grateful to Goslin's 2018 critique of my 2016 paper for giving me the opportunity to clarify my own position in this respect, though some of his concerns with my position were addressed in my earlier work on body modification, Lemma, 2010. I want to focus on the double meaning of the given body, that is the sexed body we are born into and the body given to us de facto by our parents, linking us to them irrespective of any changes we subsequently make to the given body. Our given body indelibly bears the trace of the mother whose body is shared in utero. But the body also serves as the most potent and concrete reminder of the reality of the parental couple that created it in the first place. Our orientation to reality has a temporal dimension that is related to these basic facts of life. In this sense, we might say that the configuration of the body in the mind is intrinsically temporal. The body's very origins are concrete evidence of a specifically before me time dimension, before I was conceived, before I was born, before I was. Being cognizant of what I am referring to as before me-ness exposes us inevitably to an experience of exclusion and passivity relative to those who give us life through a union that not only excludes us, but also creates us. In other words, we have to bear the pain of exclusion and the envy of the couple's creativity. This is the basis for establishing the Oedipal structure in the mind and hence respect for the differences between generations. Dependency on our objects has an intrinsically temporal dimension. It requires tolerating not only the object's independence and hence their absence in the present, but also the object's independent existence prior to our coming into being, that is our absence in their past. When all goes well, the fact of before me-ness is integrated with an experience of as I am now, in the present, to form a stable representation of the self, rooted in the body. Living in time requires acceptance not only of change, but also of continuity, that is acceptance of what cannot be changed even with the passing of time, Boris, 1987, 1994. The representation we have of our bodies, despite the inevitable physical changes the body will undergo over time, retains nevertheless a core stability based on the integration of its link to developmental history, along with the idiosyncratic fashioning of the body that marks it as also separate from the primary objects. It is not therefore only change that has to be managed at the level of one's bodily representation, for example because of the changes brought on by puberty or by aging or SRS. We also need to manage psychically the meaning of the continuity of the given body and the objects it inevitably ties us to. This continuity overrides any actual changes the body may undergo over time because the continuity I have in mind here relates to the given body's link with the past and its developmental history. How this link is then managed psychically is a separate question insofar as changing the body may be for some people the only way to live, and even the better way to live. But awareness of the psychic function of body modification is a vital component of good enough adjustment. Extensive modification of the body has a potential impact on the temporal link that is an important feature of our identity because it provides continuity between different representations of the self over time. Lemma, 2016. This is not only so for transgender individuals, but whenever the body is significantly modified. The development of a sense of identity, as outlined by Grinberg and Grinberg, 1981, is the outcome of a process of continued interaction of three lines of integration, namely the spatial, temporal, and social. The extent to which the temporal link can be maintained between the given body that once was and the post-modification body that replaces it makes a significant difference to post-operative adjustment. Successful post-surgery adaptation is associated, in my experience, with the individual's capacity to relate to their new, edited body always as also a reconstructed body with a history. By editing, I have in mind cutting out as much as adding in to give a new form to the body. SRS and other medical interventions undoubtedly bring relief to some transgender individuals and make a difference to their quality of life, but embodied history and the experience of loss cannot be bypassed without psychic consequences. This is the area that requires painful psychic work. Quinidaz, 1998, 2002. We can add breasts where there were once none, we can take away a penis where there was once one, but it is impossible to obtain the original genitalia of the opposite biological sex. The acquired genitalia, and hence the new body, is always in the wake of a body that once was. This has nothing to do with whether the pursuit of a different body is healthy or not, if this is right or wrong. It is about recognizing how we relate to the given body and what it means to us in the unconscious. Signposts. Understanding the breadth of meaning and function that is subsumed under transgender as an identity referent requires that we think not only in terms of societal gender ascriptions, but also in terms of the subjective experience of embodiment, of the body's unconscious identifications, and hence the psychic function of the modification of the body. Body and mind are an inseparable unit, as Gadini aptly put it. For psychoanalysis, the body and mind form a functional continuum, the main element of which is a process of differentiation going from body to mind, but through which psychoanalysis, going by way of the mind, can ultimately arrive at the body. Gadini, 1987, 315. Arriving at the body is a core aim in work with transgender individuals, but this work requires that we also keep in mind that embodiment is always precarious and evolving. Working in this area poses many challenges for the therapist, not least countertransferentially. Modifications to the body, some irreversible, especially when sought at a young age, can be emotionally arousing for the therapist. In my clinical work, I have repeatedly noted the pressure to act that the patient brings because they feel they must change their body in order to feel better. Their desperation is poignant, and they may even feel very suicidal. In time, this emotional pressure can lead the therapist to interpret unconscious meaning prematurely, thereby also acting in an attempt to press pause in the accelerated and sometimes quite manic process of seeking medical intervention. This can then leave the patient feeling that the therapist does not believe their experience of their body and does not support what they feel they need to do in order to feel better. With some patients, the therapist may need to wrestle with their view that it is not in the patient's best interests to commence any kind of medical intervention whilst needing to understand that this may be quite the opposite of the patient's own view on the matter. This is especially challenging when working with children and adolescents, as we will see in the next chapter. There is no fail-proof response to this challenge. Faced with a difference of opinion of this nature in the therapeutic relationship, I have found that it is helpful to acknowledge the tension as a fact, marking my interventions clearly so as to communicate that whilst I have a perspective on the patient's predicament, this does not mean that it has more validity or is the last word on the matter. Holding with integrity the position that I am advocating here, and hence managing one's own countertransference, is facilitated through experience of working with a reasonable number of transgendered patients so as to appreciate the spectrum of meanings of a transgender identification and its longer-term outcomes. As I have been suggesting throughout this book, it is a mistake to assume that there is one homogeneous group of transgendered individuals to whom we can apply a single theory. This is why it is helpful for the therapist, even essential, I would argue, if they have also worked with individuals who have transitioned and made a good enough adaptation post-operatively. This broader perspective helps the therapist to manage what can otherwise become a potentially biased internal position, viewing any kind of transitioning as an indicator of pathology and as never yielding a better adaptation. Experience gives greater confidence to trust one's own countertransference when faced with the intensity of feelings generated by this work. Through my work in this field, I have come to the view that it is important to confront the psychological and physical reality that a natal woman or man is different to a trans woman/man who has medically transitioned. By different, I mean that they are different in a purely descriptive, non-normative sense. The transgender with /man is therefore no less deserving of respect and equal rights than a cisgender with /man. The difference lies in the experience of a surgically modified body in the wake of a body that once was, which is never without psychic meaning or consequence, and in how this experience is psychically represented consciously and unconsciously. The experience of transitioning, of living in the natal body with its particular genital configuration and then inhabiting a reconstructed body with a different configuration contributes to different experiences of arousal, desire, and unconscious fantasies, and to different representations of the body in the mind. This amounts to the history of an individual over time, marked on the body, and exists in the mind as a self-narrative. This journey is an integral part of what it means to be a trans woman/trans man. It cannot be wiped out as of no consequence to the self or in relationship to others. This is something that most of the transgender patients I work with readily acknowledge. Stating descriptively, for example, that a natal man is not the same as a trans man does not imply greater or lesser psychopathology or more or less value as a person. My stance does not invalidate the transgender individual's experience of what it means to them to be a woman/man, or the rights commensurate with that position. That such a difference can be used unfairly by some to discriminate against the transgender was/man is a very important but separate issue that requires urgent consideration. But I have not attempted to do so here, focusing instead on the experience of the individual in relation to their sense of identity and of their body.